What's going on right now will serve as a benchmark for the future for drivers to get paid what they should be getting paid. And this article just explains things perfectly. And you can see right away, Uber and Lyft are the corporations that cry wolf. What's kind of funny about this article is a lot of things they talk about are things I've mentioned in previous videos. This is kind of a overview of what's going on in Minneapolis. I've done a bunch of videos about this already. I'm very heavily invested in this whole situation, as most of you know, because this, I gotta be honest, I think 100% will serve as a benchmark for the future, right? Especially with all the nitty-gritty stuff I'm gonna talk about in this article. And here's the biggest thing, is that a new Minneapolis law sets a minimum wage for rideshare drivers, right? And they've done this a bunch of times in a lot of different situations, states, countries even, cities, etc., where if something happens that Uber and Lyft doesn't like, they say, you know what, we're going to leave, right? And you can see right here, they're threatening to leave the city on May 1st when the pay takes effect. They're also lobbying the state to pass a law preempting the pay standard. And this is something I'm really glad the article is doing, is that basically to really understand what's going on, we need to zoom out from the Twin Cities and consider what Uber and Lyft are doing nationally and internationally. The reason why I'm so invested in this article, because you may say, Mark, it's Minneapolis. It's not like a big city or whatever. But remember, most cities, like I've mentioned before, are not New York and Los Angeles, right? Let's talk about America for a second. Most cities are not these gigantic big cities where, you know, even though Prop 22 happened in California and something happened in New York with their wage law, they were able to make it work because they're big cities. Minneapolis is an example or an epitome of what would happen in a typical city if there was a wage law to, like, say, give drivers a minimum hourly guarantee or have more protections, right? And that's why I'm so invested in this, because this could be the first time that Uber and Lyft in modern day society, if I'd call it, maybe not modern, I'll call it modern day ride sharing society, has left an area, right? Yes, I know what happened in Austin years ago. Ride sharing was a completely different thing. Ride sharing was completely different in 2016 compared to now. And here it is. In a nutshell, when their laws not to their liking are passed, these gig corporations have repeatedly, over and over again, threatened to stop operating in a jurisdiction. And that's the big kind of issue, right? Going down here now, because in case you don't know, Lyft is just in America and Canada. Uber is international. It's worldwide. Like, I remember, excuse me, I didn't. But I went to order an Uber, I remember in Costa Rica when I was there, right? So Uber's everywhere, which is a bigger, I think, example to look at, because what's kind of unfortunate, and I'll talk about this a bit later in this video, is I do think Uber and Lyft have a quasi-monopoly over what's going on, right? Even though it's two different companies, I would argue it's a monopoly over the ride-sharing world because they can do this, right? As it says right here, Uber perhaps is the champion of this maneuver. If they don't like something, they're just pulling out, right? It's pledged to leave Barcelona, Quebec, Providence, Seattle, and the entire country of Austria. Some instances have been unrelated to workers' rights. In Phoenix, Uber and Lyft threatened to suspend airport service in response to a city council bill institutioning a per trip fee on airport pickups and drop-offs, so rider corporations would contribute to the airport's infrastructure like other airport vendors. When the law finally took effect, they didn't suspend services after all. So they kind of got caught in their bluff. They're like, hey, we don't like this. We're not going to do any airport services. And then once it passed, they're like, all right, fine. And that's a big question to ask yourself. It's very interesting to see what's going to happen in a few weeks, at least at the time of this video, where it's like, if Uber and Lyft does actually leave and things are fine in Minneapolis, that's a massive sign saying, hey, we don't need Lyft and Uber. And I've seen articles that other ride-sharing companies like Empower and Rides, like I've mentioned before, are starting to kind of go into that market. In addition, you know, I did a video where there was talk of giving, I think it's like $150,000 to other ride-sharing companies to bring them in. In addition, it does bring up the question, you know, if Uber and Lyft does, it looks like May 1st does happen, and Uber and Lyft doesn't leave, that's another big sign too of like, oh wow, they said they were going to leave, but they didn't, which is going to serve as a huge benchmark for later on, right? And to sum this up, when legislators pass laws that hold rideshare corporations accountable or treat them like all other businesses, right, which is a big thing. Ride-sharing is always a special clause. In California, something got passed called AB 5 that was about basically freelance work and gig work. And here in California, as you can imagine, especially in the the industry of movies and acting. Like, there's a ton of gig work in California. Ride sharing was the only like asterisk on AB5. Kind of annoying, right? So what does Uber and Lyft do? They whip out a well-known corporate playbook, claim the sky's falling to customers, workers, policymakers, and communities by misrepresenting policy proposals or exaggerating their potential impact, threatening to leave until the policymakers back off. Basically saying, making up all this stuff, or are they, which I will talk about in a second, saying all this stuff and then saying, you know what, we're going to leave. But here's a big thing. Other cities have legislated minimum pay for drivers, and the sky has not fallen. There's not been issues. In 2018, New York enacted the first countrywide minimum pay standard for ride-hail drivers. It resulted in a 9% increase in pay, and a more recent pay standard for food delivery workers has similarly positive results, like I talked about before with Uber Eats, Postmates, DoorDash, etc. Similar history played out in Seattle. In 2020, both success stories took the place over the loud objections of Uber and Lyft. Things were fine. This is a big one. I've not done a video about this, but there's a huge article where they studied over 1 billion Uber and Lyft rides, or excuse me, specifically Uber rides, I take that back. And here's an interesting thing. After studying 1 billion Uber rides between 2019 and 2023, they found that fares increased at a high rate in Chicago, which has no driver pay standards than New York. Kind of demonstrating, like, wait a minute. If Uber and Lyft keep saying things like, oh, people are going to have to pay a ton of money for their ride, and drivers, yeah, they'll make a minimum wage, but there might not be that many rides because no one's going to order because they're too expensive, seems to all be BS. Hate to say it, you know? Clearly, Uber and Lyft has this boy who cries wolf problem. And I've talked about this before in other videos, and it seems like that, like, of course, let's be honest. I know it sounds stupid to say, but it's important for this video. Uber and Lyft doesn't want this to happen. Of course. They don't want this to happen because they're going to have to take more money out of their own pockets. And their biggest argument typically all the time is A, we're going to leave if we don't like it, which is what they say all the time. But two, and B, they claim that it's going to be a ripple effect where they have to charge passengers more, which means passengers take Uber and Lyft less. They use less ride sharing, which equals less rides for drivers, which equals, at the end of it, less pay for drivers, or the ride sharing world being not as good in this area. Seems like that's not true at all, right? And the big thing is, will they really follow through this time? There's been a lot of attention on this story because this is a very, very big sign of what would happen, right? On either way, you know, they, like I said before, they may want to make an example of Minneapolis to quell similar effects in Chicago, Colorado, and elsewhere. That's why a lot of people are looking at this, because they may say, hey, let's say Uber and Lyft, they do pull out, and it's a mess in Minneapolis. That could be, like, in my opinion, the worst case scenario, because no, Uber and Lyft could say, hey, see what happened in Minneapolis? Now it gives them, like, the bargaining power and the rights to say, yeah, you saw what happened there. Do you really want to try to pass that new law in Colorado, Chicago, etc.? On the other hand, the only U.S. jurisdiction that we're aware of that they did leave briefly was Austin, Texas, right? Like I mentioned earlier, but I got to be honest, I think that it was a very different climate, right? Like I said, it was 2016. I mean, that was still the infancy stages of ride sharing where people were still even against it. They didn't know what it was. It's a little bit vague. Now it's everywhere, right? Ride sharing is an integral part of our society, whether you like it or not. I think it's a good thing, right? Let's be honest. But, you know, something to be aware of. And here's the thing. If Uber and Lyft didn't leave Minneapolis, the workers, vehicles, and customers central to their business would all still be there. Like I said, roughly about 10,000 people would be out of jobs. There's roughly about 10,000-ish rideshare drivers. And granted, do all 10,000 rely on that income from Uber and Lyft? No. But that's still a huge amount, and there's still a good amount of people who do rely on it. And probably most of them do, right? And it says here that their departure would cause some initial disruption, for sure. But a number of other companies are already chomping at the bit to provide a fairer alternative should the ride-hail behemoths depart, including a driver-owned co-op platform. So that's a big thing, like I've talked about before, that for this whole situation, there are other companies in place. Now, let's say if there wasn't, and they had to rely on taxis, that might be a mess. But like I said, rides, Empower, there could be other ones going on, right? So you can see here too, you know, not even just with these other companies kind of coming in, that the government can play a role. City Council Committee is considering allocating funds, and they have, like I said before, about $150K to support new companies, which may be better suited for the work. Dallas recently selected Alto, which I've heard about before, a rideshare service that treats drivers as employees with rights and benefits for a 5-year contract for curbside airport service. And here's the big kicker. And this is why I'm so invested in this story to see what's going to happen. Is that Uber and Lyft are playing a game of chicken with serious self-risk. And it could go either way. I hate to say it. This could go either way. If they leave Minneapolis and everything turns out fine, their threats to leave other markets will forever lose their punch. I've mentioned that in so many other videos. That's why I say it's kind of funny reading this article. I'm like, wait, they're mentioning everything I've said because it's true. That if things turn out fine, they cannot use that argument anymore. On the other end, though, like I said, it could go the other way. I mean, let's say, for example, Uber and Lyft does not, so they do decide to leave the area and things tank and it's a huge mess. They could use that as even greater bargaining power for future situations that they're not the biggest fan of. And these two last points, in my opinion, are some of the most important points on this article. That one, a state commission expert study found that Minnesota Uber and Lyft drivers often make less than minimum wage after their expenses are deducted. This is no surprise to any rideshare driver out there. And the second big thing, though, and this is the big one, is the real issue here is whether businesses that are no different from others, except that they hire workers via an app, should be able to write their own rules, or whether the government representing the people should make these decisions. With all that being said, what do we do? Like, what should we do in general? What would I do if, let's say, I was in Minneapolis and everything? A couple of things I will say. I think, one, the biggest thing right now is time to see how this plays out. I believe they're going to be talking about this again on April 11th to kind of look at everything again and be like, all right, do we really want to do this? Do we really want to go forward with this law? And as a result, Lyft and Uber could potentially leave. One, a big thing is just waiting to see what happens. But going to point number 2 in terms of what is going to happen, what should they do, etc., I'd say let this play out. It is a bit of a gamble, I think, on both ends, though, right? On both ends. Because, like I said, and this article said as well, like hitting the nail on the head, well, if we roll the dice and Uber and Lyft actually do leave and things go well, Uber and Lyft has this huge drop in their bargaining power where other cities and states looking at this, and a lot of them are, will say, hey, Uber Lyft left and Minneapolis did fine. Maybe we can do the same. So that's the first big thing. That's a huge one. On the other end, though, if, let's say, Uber and Lyft does leave and things do not do well, that gives them more bargaining power. So there is a bit of a gamble on this. In addition, the second big thing on this is if, let's say, they are calling Uber and Lyft's bluff. Uber and Lyft saying, hey, you know what? We're going to leave. We don't like what you guys are doing. And then, let's say, May 1st rolls around, and then Uber and Lyft says, you know what? All right, fine, I guess we'll stay. Like they eventually just say, you know what? Okay, fine, well, we're going to stay. That's also another big bargaining power for Minneapolis to be like, hey, well, Uber and Lyft did say they were going to leave, and then they didn't. That gives them even more power, I think, to this. So I think this is kind of tough, right? My biggest thing, though, and this is what I really hope, because they are going to be talking about this again, is I really hope they don't roll it back. That's my biggest concern. I would hate for Minneapolis to say, you know what? We don't know if Uber and Lyft's actually going to leave. We don't know what's going to happen if Uber and Lyft does leave, right? There's all these uncertainties. In order to give us, I think, a more comfortable certainty, we're just going to roll this new law back, this new legislation back. That way Uber and Lyft stays. I hope they really don't do that. Because this, like I said, is going to serve as a huge benchmark and epitome of what happens in a typical city when something like this does get put into play. And I said before in other videos that I feel like because LA and New York are such big areas, when the wage law got put into place, there's so many riots happening all the time. That's my personal guess as to why Uber and Lyft wasn't as aggressive to quote-unquote leave. I will say, though, they spent something like, what was it, 150 or something like over $150 million here in California collectively of Uber and Lyft to make sure riders stay as independent contractors. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money, of course, right? So maybe it's a little bit different, and maybe they're like, we'll take what we can get. But here's the big thing. I think this has to play out in real time and just see what happens. I really hope this happens because, like I said, they are going to be reconvening, like I said, I believe on April 11th, excuse me. This is going to be a big deal. And I'm telling you, regardless of what happens, good or bad, and it could go either way, or maybe a combination. Maybe it's a very unique, interesting thing that happens overall. Either way, this could, and in my opinion, potentially will be, as long as it plays out, the biggest benchmark for rights for drivers. The reason why is if things go well, whether it's with Uber and Lyft leaving and let's say taxis pull in and things are fine, other ride-sharing apps come into play and they're fine. Or if Uber and Lyft just doesn't leave at all, if any one of those situations happens, I think about, if the city's going to gamble, which they probably will, I think their odds are more in their favor than Ubers and Lyfts. Because, in my mind, there's only one scenario about this that could be negative for the ride-sharing world, or the drivers in the ride-sharing world. And that is, things go really, really badly. That would be bad. But the positives are Uber and Lyft stays, which could happen. That's huge. The positives are Uber and Lyft leaves, and they're fine when it comes to, like, say, taxis or other situations of means of transportation. That's a second positive. Third potential positive, and there could be a combination of all these in some ways. Third potential positive is a different ride-sharing company comes into play, and things are fine as well, or maybe even multiple, like Empower Rides. Also, they did a deal in Dallas, as you saw. So there's a lot of other options, and I think, in my mind, I think they are going to be going forward with this because the city's also even talked about, like I said, putting in $150K to potentially help out other ride-sharing companies to come into the city, take over means of operations, et cetera, et cetera. This is just so massive. And I think if I had to guess, I think they are leaning towards letting things roll out and letting the dice roll and seeing where the ball lies at the end of this. And I really hope they do, because this is something that needs to happen, right? I think the issue is Uber and Lyft has done a lot of amazing things. Love them or hate them, there's no denying, and I'd like to be very transparent in all my videos. There's no denying Uber and Lyft has given tons of people jobs when they probably couldn't. I know a lot of people said, yeah, I immigrated to America and I had no way to get a job, but I could drive for Lyft and Uber. Or like say, and I mentioned this before, you don't have a car, and it's kind of this paradox where you're like, well, I need a car to get to my job, but I need a job to pay for that car. Well, you can rent one through Uber and Lyft. Some of the rental options aren't the best, but you can at least start there and work your way up. So Uber and Lyft's done amazing things for drivers. On the other end, passengers taking Ubers and Lyfts, reducing DUIs. Like say if you're elderly, disabled, or handicapped and you can't get to and from work, it was just more convenient for you, right? Like there's a lot of benefits to Uber and Lyft. On the other end, I think with the power that Uber and Lyft has inevitably gained, it does allow them to have a quasi-monopoly. And I've mentioned this in a lot of other videos that, yeah, maybe it's not just one company per se, but Uber and Lyft do work together in these kind of situations, and there is power in numbers, love it or hate it. And as a result of that, that means that in these situations, Uber and Lyft pairs together saying, okay, it's not just Uber's leaving or Lyft's leaving, which would be interesting. I mentioned that earlier. It would be kind of interesting to see. I think I mentioned that in a prior video. But the bigger one on top of that is that they're both planning on leaving and using their powerhouse stranglehold with power in numbers to create the desired effect that they want from a business perspective. But as a lot of this evidence has shown, Uber and Lyft, for the most part, would be fine if something like this happens. They might not like it because, like, say, their shareholders don't get enough money or as much money as they did before, but if they could make it work. In addition, drivers would make more money. It'd be a benefit. And then lastly, passengers wouldn't have to spend as much money as Uber and Lyft is saying. It is a game of chicken. That's really what it comes down to. That Uber and Lyft is saying, oh, all of these passengers would have to spend a ton more money. And like I said earlier, be this ripple effect, et cetera, et cetera. But as he demonstrated, that's actually not the case. If you look at like New York versus Chicago and these billion rides that were studied, actually, when a new wage law got put into effect, that much happened differently, right? And yes, places are different than New York, right? In LA, like I said, but even still, I feel like things would be fine. Uber and Lyft doesn't want this to happen just because it affects their bottom line. That's really it, in my opinion, at the end of the day. But I think the biggest thing is to see what happens in a few weeks. I'm very curious because if I had to guess, and I'm not much of a gambling person, I will say that. But if I had to gamble on this, there's probably somewhere in Vegas you could probably bet on this. I don't know. But, and I had to roll the dice on this. I'd say that I think Minneapolis will be fine. I think it might be a little bit rocky, if I had to be honest. I think when Uber and Lyft initially leaves, I can see a lot of people, even the next day, flying into the airport, pulling up almost instinctively, like a reflex, Uber and Lyft, and them saying, sorry, we're not available in your area. I think that could be a bit rocky in the beginning. But then people realize, okay, if I'm going into the airport. I can't order an Uber and Lyft. I have to get in power. Now, there could be some annoying things about that. You have to download a new app. You have to enter in your credit card information, which a lot of people still, understandably, a lot of people feel uncomfortable doing that. So there are some kind of tricky hurdles that would have to be overcome. There's no denying that. But I think at the end of the day, things will be fine. And then lastly, like I said too, which could be a huge benefit for everyone, is Uber and Lyft says, you know what? Fine, we'll stay. And things turn out fine. I think there's more, if I did look at it as like a gamble, it's not like, to me, like a 50-50, like, using that analogy again with gambling, like a roulette wheel, which I think is actually a little bit less than 50-50, because you have that, but anyway, it's not as much of like, I think, a risky gamble. I think the odds are in their favor that regardless of what happens, it's going to be a benefit, not only to Minneapolis, but to the ride-sharing world, not the businesses, but the ride-sharing world of drivers and passengers, because now other cities can see that things worked out fine here. And as a result of that, that will equal other cities following suit, which gives Uber Lyft way less bargaining power and pays drivers the amount they should be getting paid.